Hello everyone and welcome back to TowerGate. Welcome to the weekend edition, Saturday. It is TowerGate Day 317, January the 20th, 2018. Thank you so much for tuning in. As promised, today we're going to dig into the Uranium One scandal. I'm going to try to make the Uranium One deal, which is kind of complex with a lot of things going on. I'm going to try to make it easy and understandable as much as I can because it's one of these plots that's got a lot of twists and turns and a lot of things going in a lot of different directions all at the same time. And that's that was done on purpose. That was exactly the point, was to create all this complex web of diversions and things to throw people off the trail. And basically to hide or keep the truth from the individuals that would be the members of Congress who would have to look at this deal if they thought there was a problem, and they may shoot it down. So this had to be done in order for it to be successful, for this plot to work. It had to be conducted within a small group of influential people who could make the deal happen and keep it away from the members of Congress who could shut it down if they learned about what was done to make the deal happen and who it involved in order to make it happen. So it's excuse me, it's kind of a complex deal, but I'm going to give you the official back narrative first, and then we'll go through and break it down so we can see each of the individual parts moving isolated. So essentially, the Uranium One story is about how the State Department, the Department of Energy, and the FBI allowed the sale of 20% of U.S. uranium production and the uranium production in Kazakhstan to Russia through a tangled web, and how the FBI, headed up by Mueller and then Comey, failed to inform the Congress about the criminal activity that led to the completion of the deal, and how the Clinton Foundation and Bill Clinton pocketed millions of dollars during the time the Russian plot was being carried out. So the Russian plot, the goal of the Russian plot, was to be able to gain licensing that would allow them to sell uranium to American energy providers, because Russia owned this big Russian state energy company called Rosatom, and they wanted to have Rosatom gain control of this uranium production, but more importantly, to have that license which would allow them to sell this uranium, because that's what they lacked. You see, they had a large holdings of uranium, but not inside the United States, and even if they bought into shares into these public companies, it still would not give them control. It would not allow them to have the licensing that would be required for them to sell the product. So it's, you know, if you're mining the uranium, but you don't have the license to sell it to the energy providers, it's really worthless. So what the Russians needed was to be able to get the license to be able to sell the uranium once they got control of it. The problem is, if the Russians tried to directly do that, it would of course be shot down. The committees in Congress that oversee it, and just the general idea of allowing the Russians to have that license, would simply be a non-starter. It simply wouldn't happen. So what the Russians had to do was concoct a plot which would allow them to gain the licensing rights to be able to sell this uranium once they had gotten possession of it. Now, to be able to do that, they needed to find some corrupt people to help them make the deal happen. And they believed if they could find these corrupt individuals, that they could corrupt them with money. So I imagine the Russians sat back and said, well, gee, who's people who would be able to make this happen and who are corrupt enough that they would help us do this? And of course, the Clintons popped into mind, because you have Bill Clinton, who had all his connections around the world. You had his wife, head of the State Department, who was the #1 primary, most important person that you have to get on board, because the State Department, their approval is based largely on the national security implications for a deal like this, which would be the major consideration if you are going to allow the Russians to have a license to mine and sell this uranium. It would be a national security issue. And so you really needed to get that person. So the Clintons were targeted by the Russians because, number one, they were extremely corruptible. The Russians knew they could be bought. And because Hillary Clinton, of course, was the top person at the State Department who would have to approve this and would have to be willing to overlook the national security implications of allowing this deal to go through. Now, in order to do this, the Russians had to do it in such a way that they realized they just couldn't out and out go get Hillary or anyone else to just allow them openly in front of everybody to gain this particular license. So what the Russians decided they needed to do was, rather than them trying to get the license, rather what they needed to do was buy or take possession of, by purchasing the stock, purchasing the company, taking over a company that already had licensing to sell uranium to American energy providers. So let's go through the timeline of just the events that were set into place to make this deal go down. It all started in 2005. Rosatom, R-O-S-A-T-O-M, Rosatom, which you've probably heard, is the Russian state-owned company that mines uranium. Now, they did not possess the export license for a newly mined uranium in the United States. So, the Russians put together a three-part plan to overcome the problem. So, in 2005, money from Uranium One investors began flowing into the Clinton Foundation, and it continued through 2011. During that time, Bill Clinton flew to Kazakhstan with Frank Gustra, a Canadian mining financier, also the former owner of Liongate Entertainment. And, of course, they made this flight aboard Mr. Gustra's private jet. Within days of their visit to Kazakhstan, Mr. Gustra's company, Eurasia Energy, signed a deal giving it stake in 3 state-run uranium mines in Kazakhstan. Now, it wasn't so much, this company wasn't so important because they're a very small, what we consider a fledgling startup sort of company, and there wasn't really a lot going on with the mining in Kazakhstan, but they were a critical first step to get to the next step. So that's why Bill Clinton, with his buddy Frank Gustra, moved first to go to Kazakhstan and gain control of these small energy operations there where they were mining uranium. So 2 years later, in 2007, because this process takes about 2 years, in 2007, Eurasia Energy then merges with the South African mining company called Uranium One. At which time, as soon as the deal goes through, Gustra sells his stake in the company, meaning Eurasia Energy. And Uranium One begins buying up U.S. uranium assets. 2 years later, 2009, Rosatom, the Russian state-owned energy company, buys a 17% stake in Uranium One. So you can see they're now moving on to step 2. Now, Rosatom seeks to buy a majority stake in Uranium One, but they're concerned about triggering oversight by CFIUS. CFIUS is the committee in Congress which deals with foreign investments. They look at these types of large deals and they decide whether or not they're good for America. If they're not, they shoot them down. So this particular move, by buying 17% of Uranium One, got them in the door, but not enough in their mind to send up the red flag, but certainly enough at that point that they could begin to move toward step 3. Now, keep in mind, CFIUS is comprised of the following agencies: the Department of Treasury, the Department of Justice, Homeland Security, Department of Commerce, Department of State, Department of Energy, and the Offices of Trade and Representation, as well as the Science and Technology Policy Office. Okay, so these are the groups that sit on the board of CFIUS. The most important two would be the Department of Justice and the Department of State. The Department of Justice, because they look at the issues on the domestic side, and because the State Department, again, because of the national security implications of some type of a deal like this going through. So now we fast forward to 2013. Rosatom now buys 100% of Uranium One, and then they delist the company from the Toronto Stock Exchange, now making it a private Russian company. So essentially they complete the three-part plan. So they were able to go from owning 17% to 100%, essentially taking over the company, and this deal was allowed to go through by CFIUS. So this is basically how the plan in a three-stage effort was done, but it could only have been done with CFIUS allowing it to happen. Now let's take a look at a couple of the connections. There are specifically 5 connections, 5 things within this time period of 2005 to 2013 that allowed all these things to happen. And so let's go through them and the players and what they did to make it all happen. First, we had Rosatom, the Russian state energy company, which owned 70% of the world's uranium fuel market. Then we had TENEX, T-E-N-E-X. This is the Russian nuclear fuel and nuclear fuel cycle technology exporting company. They're the ones who export the uranium. And that is 100% owned by Rosatom. So keep in mind, Rosatom, the Russian state-owned energy company, owns TENEX. Now, TENAM, T-E-N-A-M, is a U.S.-based subsidiary of Rosatom. So TENAM is under TENEX, and TENEX is the American subsidiary of Rosatom. Now, the entity through which 20% of the U.S. uranium mining was purchased by Russia. So in 2011, TENAM was awarded the right to sell uranium to U.S. nuclear plants. So as you can see, the deal goes through Rosatom, the company under them, TENEX, and then their U.S. subsidiary, which is TENAM, which is the company that actually could get the license or would now possess the license because they essentially purchased it in the deal, would have the license now to sell to U.S. nuclear energy companies. Basically, U.S. nuclear power plants would now be buying this mined uranium, which was mined by the Russian energy company. So now Eurasia Energy Limited, of course, they were the small fledgling uranium resource company that purchased uranium assets in Kazakhstan in 2007 that eventually merged with Uranium One. Next we have Frank Gustra, another important connection to make all this go down. He was the mining financier and owner of Eurasia Energy. Gustra donated $31.3 million to the Clinton Foundation shortly after Bill Clinton traveled with him to Kazakhstan to orchestrate his purchase of state-run uranium assets in the country. Next we have the FBI. Now the FBI at the time was running a confidential FBI informant named William F. Campbell. And at the time that the Uranium One deal was sanctioned, William Campbell was involved for about a 6-year period of time, up until the time that CFIUS sanctioned the deal. Through that whole time, William F. Campbell, the FBI informant, was inside and documenting every bit of this and collecting evidence. Next we have Rod Rodenstein, who was at the time of the deals going down the U.S. attorney in Maryland. And this is the state where TENAM was based. And keep in mind, 10M was the key to all this because they held the license to sell uranium, which 10X did not, and Uranium One did not until the deal went through. Now, the investigation into 10M and into 10X is what led to the prosecution of Vladimir Mikurin, who was the president of 10M. Robert Mueller was a major connection here, and of course that's because he was the director of the FBI that was investigating the Uranium One sale, and he was running William Campbell as an informant. He's also the FBI director who, along with Comey, failed to bring this matter to Congress to tell them what was going on, even though he had an obligation to do so. And this is why Uncle Bob, the executioner Mueller, has a lot of problems coming down the road because of his actions or lack of actions and taking responsibility and doing what he was obligated to do, which was to make the Congress and the committees and CFIUS aware of this plot that had been set in place, which he knew very well of. And he said nothing, and that makes him liable. Of course, we had CFIUS, which is the Committee on Foreign Investment, which reviews and authorizes transactions that could result in control of U.S. businesses by foreign actors that could compromise American national security. Next, we have the Rotten Reverend Clinton, who was Secretary of State before, during, and after the sale of 20% of America's uranium production to Russia. And, of course, she is, as Secretary of State, was one of the two key officials whose decision would have been the most prominent in allowing the deal to go through because of the national security implications of turning over these mining rights and the ability to sell this mined uranium to American nuclear companies. Next, we have Ian Telfer, who was a prominent investor in Eurasia and chairman of Uranium One. Telfer donated $2.35 million to the Clinton Foundation while the uranium deal was being reviewed by CFIUS. Telfer's contribution was never reported by the Clintons, despite ethics rules that would require disclosure of this donation. The Clinton Foundation, which received $148 million from foreign persons and corporations, companies, from 2005 to 2011. This money came from the Russian government and from Russian energy oligarchs. Of course, we have William Campbell, the FBI informant, who documented the crime while working as a undercover agent. He was never asked to testify to Congress, and then when he tried to come forward, he was slapped with a gag order by Loretta Lynch. Then, of course, we have Vladimir Mikurin, the director of Pan American Department of 10X and 10M. So these are all the players, all the connections, and all the things that were done in this three-step plan for the Russians to gain not only the mining rights, but the license that would allow them to sell that mined uranium to American nuclear power companies. And as you can see, the deal never should have gone down because of the national security implications, but to get around that, the Russians decided that they just simply needed to find the person who would be most important in making the deal go down and finding out if they were corruptible enough to participate. And this is really the issue because they, of course, found the Clintons. And, of course, they knew the Clintons, how corrupt they were and everything else. But whether or not they would go along with it, they had to be paid and taken care of. And, of course, we can see they got $148 million to the Clinton Foundation, and Slick Willie got a $500,000 for a one-hour speech he gave to these very Russian oligarchs who would be the contributors also to the $148 million to the Clinton Foundation and the people who would benefit from the sale of of this deal going through and the approval of this deal going through. So as you can see, it's a very dirty, corrupt deal, and it's just one of many that are dovetail into the investigation into the Clinton Foundation. So you have a separate investigation right now ordered by Attorney General Jeff Sessions about, well, we learned about it a couple weeks ago, but it appears that it actually happened 4 months ago. But there's also the two field offices from the FBI that are looking into the Clinton Foundation and the pay for play. So whether you approach this from an investigation of Uranium One or whether you approach this from the direction of starting with the Clinton Foundation and pay for play, both of these investigations will tie the two together, the Clinton Foundation with the Uranium One deal with the pay for play. It doesn't matter which end you start from, you're going to end up at the same place, and that is with the Clinton Foundation and their association and Hillary's position in the State Department as being one of the key people that would approve the deal. And then, of course, you have the cover-up, which would include Comey and Mueller. It would include Lynch and Holder, two attorney generals and two FBI directors that were in place during the 6-year period that this 3-step plan was being carried out. And, of course, they all had to know about all of it, and they said nothing, even though they were obligated to say something, because clearly it is an issue with national security to turn over this, and especially if money changed hands and influence was bought to make the deal happen. Now, keep in mind, there's 5 field offices looking at the Clinton Foundation pay for play, which would, of course, include this deal with Uranium One. And we know that 2 of the 5 field offices, the guy that's heading up in Arkansas is a Trump-appointed U.S. attorney who we're told is a straight shooter, and he's been on this for 4 months. And, of course, then we have the U.S. attorney who's in New York, who is or was Rudy Giuliani's law partner in the law firm that they're partners in. And he's the man heading up the New York field office that's looking into this. So we know that we have 2 players who are definitely not part of the deep state swamp. And one a Trump-appointed attorney, U.S. attorney, and the other a Trump-appointed U.S. attorney in New York. I don't know about the other 3 field offices, but these 2, which are the 2 most important, are the ones heading up and looking into all this, which is why we can expect that there will be more than just the person who was indicted last weekend on 11 counts. He is one of the co-owners of the companies that actually was the trucking companies that moved the uranium. And he was involved in bribes and various other RICO violations. So you can expect that that's just the beginning of this investigation. And, of course, they always work from the outside in and from the bottom up in these investigations. So they will eventually make it to the Clintons. They will probably be in the top tier, and so it may take several months or what have you. But eventually you can expect there will be indictments against at least the Clintons for their role in this deal. But you have to assume it could include everyone that was on the CFIUS board, and it should also include certainly Rodenstein himself. Certainly Comey and Mueller are caught up in this, as well as Lynch and Holder. So these will be the people in the top tier, and it will eventually work itself up to them. You can be assured of that. There's no way to avoid it. They were the ones who made the call. So the question is now, what do we do? Well, the investigation is moving forward, as I just explained, and we have people, now we know it's not a bunch of Clinton insiders and deep state swamp dwellers that are running the show. It's actually 2 U.S. attorneys who are probably straight shooters and are not part of the swamp, who were, in fact, appointed by Trump. So we can have some confidence that we're going to get a real investigation. And based on the indictment last week of the bottom tier guy, the guy who owned the trucking company, we know that they are actually doing this. There could already be sealed indictments against all these people we just talked about, and they just haven't come out yet because they're still continuing investigating. And they'll seal an indictment when they get enough evidence against someone. They say, okay, we got this person, go ahead and do the indictment, but we don't want to release it because we're still continuing investigations, and if we unseal that indictment, it might scare off or tip off the activities that are currently ongoing that we have in our investigation. So that's why they'll have sealed indictments. They don't want to compromise the ongoing investigation. Now, what do we need to do really to to slam the door, if I can say it, to slam the door on this deal? Well, we already know that we have the FBI informant, William Campbell, who, through his attorney, Victoria Tensing, has told us basically what he's got. He's got documents, he's got phone conversations, he's got emails, he's got a ton of evidence, which we believe, according to Victoria Tensing, is going to prove that everyone was aware of what was going on with this deal. They purposely hid it from the committees that should have known about it, and that the Clintons were not just players who got set up or used or didn't know what was going on and they got sucked into it, but rather he is going to prove that the Clintons and others in this cabal were well aware of this plot and were in fact not duped by this plot, but were a part of this plot. And he says he has, or his attorney says he has, the documents and the evidence to prove it. So there are two keys to bringing these people to justice, and one of them would be the testimony and the evidence that will be provided by William F. Campbell, the FBI informant, who now has had the gag order lifted by Jeff Sessions and is free to tell the story. But the other individual who we need to, who can be the second part of this, would be the FBI special agent in charge, who in August of 2015, while conducting his investigation into the Hillary Clinton email investigation, obviously stumbled onto things about Hillary Clinton's emails that had something to do with Uranium One. And we don't know the name of this FBI special agent, has not been made public, but certainly people within the DOJ and the FBI would know who the lead special agent was that was looking into the Clinton emails. It doesn't appear it was Peter Benstrokinus or anyone like that. It was another FBI special agent who was heading up a group of other agents who were investigating the Hillary Clinton email probe, the criminal probe into her emails, which we know that the date that they began that criminal probe into Hillary on her emails was August of 2015. But we learned that this particular special agent in charge, while conducting his investigation into Hillary Clinton's emails, did the following. He sent a notification to preserve records. A notification to preserve records to the following agencies: the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, the Department of Treasury, the National Intelligence, National Counterterrorism Center, Department of Energy, Department of Nuclear Regulations and Commission. He sent this notification to preserve records also to the NSA, the CIA, the DIA, and the Department of Defense. All of these people who he sent this notification to preserve records, all would be entities that would have been involved in the Uranium One deal. All would have been involved in the Uranium One deal. So clearly, this tells us that the special agent from the FBI and his people were looking into the Clinton email investigation in August 2015, and they discovered something in some emails that led them down the path of looking into something having to do with Uranium One and this Russian energy deal. Because that's why they sent a notification to preserve records to all these organizations and government bodies that would have been involved or would have had documents that would pertain to the Uranium One thing. So, clearly the FBI agent in charge stumbled onto something that raised a red flag having to do with Uranium One and the Rotten Reverend Clinton's emails. Campbell, of course, was gagged and threatened by Mueller and then Eric Holder and Comey and Lynch, and Rodenstein knew about every bit of this. All of these people are liable and they're all in legal jeopardy. So hopefully that's not too confusing for you. So the way forward is to get William Campbell, who was the inside informant with all the evidence he has, with this FBI special agent who is working for, obviously like Campbell, but Campbell was like an agent working inside the deal. The other FBI special agent, which requested all these preservation of all these documents, and probably now has these documents, these two principal witnesses need to come forward and testify in front of Congress. And when you get the testimony of Campbell and his evidence, the testimony of this FBI special agent, who clearly, while investigating Hillary Clinton's emails, stumbled onto something in her emails that led him down the path of the Uranium One deal, you put these two together with all the evidence they have, and you will probably have the slam dunk, the evidence you need to bring the perps to justice. And that would include Mueller and Comey, Lynch and Holder, and certainly Rod Rodenstein. And he is still covering this up. It's all a big cover-up. It was not a crime for Russia to do what they did. Essentially, they involved themselves and many other people in other crimes that would fall under RICO violations, but essentially the moves that they made were not illegal. It's how they did it. But what we're looking at here is on the part of the officials in the American government who sat on the CFIUS committee, or who may have accepted bribes and other things to let the deal go through. They are really the ones who face the most criminal liability. There are others involved, of course, because there were crimes committed in the process of this three-step plot to get control of not just the mining of the uranium, but the license that would allow them to sell to American nuclear energy companies. So, and the nuclear power plants themselves, to purchase this uranium. So there you have it. That is basically the long and short of the Uranium One deal, of how it came about, who's involved, and what we need to do moving forward to finally bring it to conclusion and hold the perps accountable. That's basically how it went down. If any of you have anything to add, please put it into the comments section. I could have included much more, but I really wanted to keep this as simple as possible without getting too distracted, because there's many other things I could throw in here, but I don't want to confuse it. I want to keep it real simple so everyone can really understand the nuts and bolts of it. Everything else is just, it's important, but it makes it more confusing, and it really shouldn't be that confusing. It was a three-step plan that involved a lot of corruption between Russian officials, between the Clintons and others on the CFIUS, as well as the Department of Justice and FBI, who overlooked and allowed this all to happen. That's basically what you got. Just more of the same from the swamp. And one last thing before I go, I will be back tomorrow for the second weekend edition of TowerGate, the Sunday video. But I will say that the Democrats have gone ahead with the government shutdown. They're going to pay a massive, massive political price. I don't know how long it will take before they break and realize the decision they made, but it will probably be Monday or Tuesday when the polls come out and show the beating that they're taking. They will collapse and give in. Trump will win this. The Republicans and Trump will win if they hold their ground. Don't give in, and they will win this fight. Thanks so much for tuning in. I'll be back tomorrow. Take care.